Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Welcome, people. It's Alexandria, your favorite Caribbean historian and your host of Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture. How often have you thought about transportation in our region? Naturally, as islands, boats and ferries, and of course, planes immediately come to mind, especially as a means of accessing other islands in the greater diaspora. How often, though, have you considered trains? In Jamaica, for what was once the fourth country in the world to have a railway system, there have been some recent talks about revitalizing our railway system, especially at the latter half of last year. The reason for this revitalization, however, stems from a longer history leading back to an accident many of this generation know very little about, and that is the 1957 Kendal Railway tragedy. Joining us for a very interesting take on this story is author and handwriting identification expert Beverley East. Miss East, thank you so much for joining us. Why don't you tell us a bit about yourself more, where in the Caribbean is near and dear to you, and what motivated you as an author before we start on our episode today?
Thank you for having me. I'm Beverley East. I am a born Jamaican, but I reside in the United States. I'm a handwriting forensic document examiner as well as an author. My main reason often when I'm in Jamaica is I'm working as a forensic document examiner, examining fraud and looking at signatures that are fraud. I've written 3 books. Very dear to my heart is The Reaper of Souls, the Kendal crash story of 1957.
Thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. And so, just jumping right into our conversation, before we delve directly into the crash, could you set a bit of a scene for us for the 1950s, especially as the decade prior to independence?
Well, I was born in 53, and so from what I've done in my research from books is that we were still under obviously British rule. I think we were a different Jamaica than we are now. But I feel in the short time I lived here as a child, think I had quite an idyllic life, living just outside Spanish Town with my grandmother and my uncle. But I was raised in England, so most of what I could tell you about the 50s would be from research, which I have documented in my book, Reaper of Souls.
And so, setting up for what, is this massive tragedy in Jamaican history, it's just 5 years before independence. And so could you tell our listeners what exactly happened on September 1st, 1957?
There was a church outing by St Anne's Church. The train took the members of the church down to Montego Bay for a church outing. On the way back, the train derailed in the area of Manchester in Kendal. That's why it's called the Kendal crash. Because it was in between towns, the fatality was very high. And at the time in 1950s, of course, technology and phones and everything was less available. So a lot of people died slowly because of the lack of emergency services. And it's not to say that the services I think the Alcan, the company dug the roads to get people there. Blood banks were flown out. It's not like nothing was done, but more would have been done. If it had been in Montego Bay, emergency services would have been on site, but they had to get to the site, then dig. My understanding from my research is that the station master was waiting for the train and did not see the train coming into his station and started to walk down the tracks. And that's how they knew that there was an actual accident. The reason why I'm involved, very much involved with this story, is that my father's family belonged to St Anne's Church, and my father lost 14 members of his family that night because they were all a part of the excursion. My father had just moved to England, so, he wasn't able to come back. I also feel that during the 50s, between 1948 and 1957, during that time, was the Great Migration, which we know it now as the Windrush era. So there were lots of families moving from Jamaica to start life in England. The war had ended, and the British monarchy invited Caribbean people to come to England. So during the 50s, there was this great upheaval of families being separated, including my own.
And just adding a bit more context to the crash itself. So as you said, right, St. Anne's Church members have headed to Mobay for the day for the church trip. And I believe there were roughly 1,600 passengers on the train, which was supposed to be more than what should have been allotted. And I believe it was around 200 persons killed in the accident. Reportedly, another 700 were injured, as you say. And then there's also some story around how looting and robbing was also involved in terms of the reasonings behind how the tragedy occurred. And so could you point a little bit more, given that discrepancy, what was actually, the cause of the crash itself?
Yeah, there's a lot of controversy and there's a lot of different stories about how the crash actually happened. So I'm just going to tell you my version, and my version is coming from survivors. A lot of people that weren't even near the accident or don't know anybody who was on the accident have created their own stories. I'm giving you a story, my version, based on one of the priests who I met, and he told me that, first of all, the driver that took the train down to Montego Bay was not the same driver that came back. So part of the accident was caused by an inexperienced driver driving fast on a wet rail. And so when they came around the bend, that's when the train derailed. There's all these stories about looting and this and that and misbehavior on the train. That is not why the train crashed. There was a technical fault on the train and an inexperienced driver in the middle of the night on a wet night. So that's my story. And that is the story that I got from someone who survived the Kendal crash. She passed away about 2 years ago. The other story about numbers is that the government kept the numbers lower than they were. However, there's still high numbers. The same priest told me that he buried over 300 people. That's him alone. So a lot of people, I think the count counts only those that were dead the night of Kendal, the night of the crash. People died slowly after. The trauma of it, people committed suicide, or should I rephrase that? People completed suicide. So the numbers, I still don't have the right numbers. I have, from the research that I did, find different numbers. So I just usually use about 250, which is the night of the crash. But as I said, people died after, not from the crash, but from emotional trauma of the crash.
It was definitely, to your point, like the worst rail disaster in Jamaica's history. Could you speak a bit about what the national reaction to the 1957 crash was and how the Jamaican government responded?
When I started my research, we were the fifth worst crash in the history of the world, not just the region. the crash was on the front page of the New York Times. That's how serious this accident was. I think the government has not done enough. And I get very emotional about this story because it's my family that died, my grandmother, grandfather, uncles, aunts, cousins. So I'm very invested in this story. So when people are talking nonsense about this happened and this happened, and I'm like, have you spoken to a survivor or are you just making stuff up? You know, I took a year out of my company and moved to Jamaica. I was trying to write this story from America and I couldn't write it. And it was only when I returned home and began to speak to people who were still, you know, a lot of the survivors are dead. But during the time when I wrote the book, I would travel all over the island just meeting anybody that was literally on the train, not somebody that heard, you know, hearsay or knew somebody that, you know. And so when you listen to the survivor stories, all their stories are the same. But when you listen to people who were not on the train, you know, their imagination has gone a little bit skew-wide.
I also just wanted to note, you know, first off, appreciation for you for the work that you did in retelling this story, one that, you know, is so necessary and should rightfully be told as part of Jamaica's history. But also sincere condolences, of course, to your family who were lost also in the tragedy as well. I think now, fast forwarding, we are almost 66 years since the crash. How do you think it's been remembered? I think, especially as I alluded to earlier in the conversation, those of my generation, even, you know, younger than my generation, of course, probably know very little about the Kendal Railway tragedy. And so could you speak to why you maybe think that is?
It's because it's been brushed away. As I said, I don't think the government has done enough. I've been trying to get my book into the schools for years now. Well, before I wrote the book, I would come to Jamaica and do research. And I remember one year coming on the 40th anniversary of Kendal, and I thought there has to be somebody has to be doing something. And then Princess Di died, and it was like a small paragraph, the back of the paper about the Kendal, because you know Princess Di's story, sad as it was, took over the main paper, the main part of the paper. So I was determined to make sure my book came out on the 50th anniversary. Since the book has come out, a lot more has been done, not enough. There is now a committee in Manchester that's been set up solely to make sure there's a monument. I've been trying to get a monument with just the names of the people up. And then the last couple of years, just before COVID, somebody contacted me and said, there's this committee, blah, 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 blah. And I says, oh, I have so much research that you don't have to start from scratch. So I was able to give them the names of all the people that I have on my list. I got to say that shortly after my book came out, people from all over the world was calling me. I was literally drowned in sorrow. People were calling me, can you look on your list? My grandmother was on the train. Can you look on the list? My uncle was on the train, you know, and I feel like there should be not just me champion this cause. And although the committee is there, I do believe the committee is moving very slowly. They do have a commemorative service every year, but at the beginning of this committee, they were supposed to have a monument built. Well, there's still no monument, and I know COVID has slowed things down, but it's still moving very slowly. My aunt is 95 next week, and it's one of her wishes to be able to touch that monument before she dies. Our family never came back as whole bodies from Kendal. They were buried in a mass grave in Kendal. So it would be something wonderful for my aunt but she's 95. Any day we could lose her, although she is in good mind and spirit.
We've alluded to your book a few times, and obviously the wealth of research that you've done in helping us continuously commemorate Kendal. I do definitely want to allude to it greater, though, since we haven't spoken about it at length. So your novel, Reaper of Souls, is to an extent a historical fiction, obviously set in the time frame of the Kendal crash. But could you talk a bit beyond not necessarily your inspiration for the novel itself, but what has been the process like for you, and even why you decided to more so go the realm of doing a novel as opposed to maybe, a nonfiction piece?
I felt it had to be a story that would stay alive in people's hearts. So if I just wrote something about the Kendal, which originally that's what I did, I wrote 100 pages and I thought no one's going to read this. This is boring. What I did with the Kendal story is create characters that are so alive that you remember the story. It's just like 250 people died. You don't remember them. You don't know them. There's nothing there to honor them. So I thought if I had fictitious characters, if I created fictitious characters, I could turn the story any which way I wanted to, for you to hold on to that Kendal story. The facts in Kendal are absolutely correct, but my characters take you on a journey all over the place. Because I was raised in England, I felt one of my characters had to go to England, and I left characters here. I mean, I've had such a great response from the book, more than I ever anticipated. Interviewed by the BBC. One of my cousins survived Kendal, and they actually interviewed him as a witness, someone, who could tell you firsthand what that night looked like. The process for me, as I said, is that I moved from America, came to Jamaica, set up home here, put my son in school in Jamaica. Everybody thought I was crazy that I just left America and moved to Jamaica and didn't have a job. And well, had my company, but everything was on hold. And just get up every day and try and write. And because I had a young son, I found it very difficult to write every day. So my process of writing was I would make notes all week and then choose Thursday and Saturdays to write. My son would stay late on Thursday evenings to play chess. And then Saturday, he had basketball all day, and then he would want to go somewhere with his friends. So it was like I had 2 whole days every week to just think through. I used to get very depressed in the process of the writing because it's a hard story to write. So what I didn't want is for people to pick up the book and close it on page 20 because it was too sad, and it is sad. But when you read my characters, they are so full of life. I mean, people have come up to me in airports and whatever and say, why did you make Master Joe do that? And why? So when you remember the character, you remember where that character came from. I mean, there's lots of books that I've read, but sometimes I can't remember the names of that character that inspired me so much, or I can't remember the name of the book. And I would go into bookstores here in Jamaica and they would say, I'd never see my book on the shelf. And the bookseller said, oh, you don't have to worry. That book is selling. But everybody just come in and ask for the Kendal story. They don't know the name of the book. They don't know the author. But at least now, even you finding me, at least now there's a conversation, a continued conversation about Kendal. And I don't want that conversation even when I'm gone. I remember turning up at a party once and someone said to me, if you don't do anything else in your lifetime, you have brought this story back to life. So I feel that as a compliment, although there's still so much more I got to do. I want the monument to be up. I would like Reaper of Souls to be a movie. Twice I've been offered the position of, and twice the director that was interested in the movie died, and another person that was interested in the movie also died. So I'm a little kind of anxious about that.
That was actually going to be my next question. What would you like to see from here? But I think in general, we oftentimes sometimes shy away from telling and discussing tragedies in just, a national history, oftentimes, especially one that I think, to your earlier point, touches more so a rural part of Jamaica as opposed to maybe if it was like in Kingston or something, for example. But I wanted to just ask in terms of you, also saying, you want to see the monument, etc. How should we be remembering these tragedies, right? To your point about the novel, it is a sad story. The tragedy itself, and of course the impetus for the novel. But how do you think we should readily remember tragedies because they are ultimately still a part of our history?
See, whatever I say, it's just my thoughts. But like, for instance, every time I go and do a reading on, people say, well, how can we help? These days, I feel like go set up a GoFundMe page, raise some money so we can get the monument up. But I don't want to be in charge of it. You see what I'm saying? I don't want to be in charge of the money. I don't want to be in charge of that. Somebody else needs to take the reins. And I've met some wonderful people. Like, for instance, I met this woman. Well, she found me online. I'm assuming the same way you found me online. Her grandmother had died in Kendal. And she wanted me to come and meet her mother. Anyway, I did go and meet her mother, and I took a book for her. We opened the book, and in one of the pages, one of the photographs, there's a picture of all the dead bodies on the ground, and there's a little girl standing there, and that's her mother. So it makes me cold. So we consider ourselves Kendal survivors, sisters. That's who we are now. So, she lost her grandmother. I lost my grandmother. And now her mother has Alzheimer's. So she's removed from the story, but we're still connected. And I have met some amazing families through Kendal. And so many people are very kind to me because of the work I've done with Kendal. Some people don't even know that I'm a expert witness and a forensic examiner. I'll be sitting somewhere in church and they say, "Oh, that's the Kendal lady over there." They don't know my name, they don't remember my name, they don't know the name of the book. But I take it as is. I take it as is for whatever it is. I'm glad I pursued this story. It was hard to write. There's things about it that I left out because I thought it was too gruesome. Like, for instance, I left it out, but one of the journalists who was there that night said that he smells blood. To this day, he smells blood. And he said he was driving behind the ambulance where the blood from the bodies, the dead bodies were, because everybody that was whole was brought back, but all the blood was trailing from the ambulance. And that's, from Kendal to Kingston, that's like a 2.5 hour in the middle of the night. But all he could smell is blood. And he said to this day, he doesn't eat meat. He can't, the smell of blood is like just right there under his lip the whole time.
I do want to uphold, though, that to your point of all the feedback you've received, that's also largely, I think, the power of literature and of storytelling, right? Whereas people may have not learned it in schools or, it may not have showed up in history text in the same way. You've been able to cultivate this story as a novel that has touched so many and has been so accessible to people in ways that they may not have otherwise heard. So thank you so much for writing Reaper of Souls.
Thank you. I just wish, one, the government would accept the book in the school as a civic class. that universities would consider it as, part of it. It's just like if we want to create our history, we say that not enough people write about our history. But then when we write about our history, it's still out there in the field somewhere, not being accepted. But for some reason, because I spoke to several education ministers and they said, oh, it has to go through a committee. I know there is a process, but like, who are these people that are going to decide whether or not the book is accepted? It's a story that is a part of our history. So, but anyway, it just gets under my skin when I go places and they say, oh, we need to write our stories, we need to do this, and then we do it, Because even in the process of writing the story, the publisher, we had a little falling out, and I had to go and get a lawyer to get the rights back for the book, So it's easy to say, do this, and then when it's done, there's no follow-up, I mean, I used to have a radio show on RGR, and one of the main reasons I was on radio was so that when the book came out, people would trust that story with that name, that voice. But to me, it's near, people always say, out of all the books you've written, which is your favorite book? And it's like asking who is your favorite child? But Kendal really was hard emotionally to write. My cousin actually came into the house that I was renting at the time and took down all the dead pictures, because I had all the dead pictures up on the wall, and I had papers of interviews and audios versions, and then survivors were calling me asking that they want to write their own book and I must help them write their book, and it was just a lot. It was a lot. But I came through it, and I'm very, very proud of it. I still want it to be a movie. I still want the monument until I die. That will be my call to anybody that's interested in making the movie or giving money to do the monument.
I fully agree, though, that I think the monument is something that's necessary to, if we don't have these markers, if we don't have these staple things, right, it might fade from memory, right, as generations continue. So
yeah, I just get frustrated. I just believe more could have been done and should be done to get the monument up. And the committee is doing their best every year. There is, last year it rained, so we had a service inside a library. One year, my aunt, as I said, who's in her 90s, was able to come. My cousin, who was a survivor, came. One thing I would say is that a lot of people, when I say, oh, I've written a book about a train, they are surprised that we even had a railway system in the Caribbean. And I says, well, we were under British rule, so we had the best engineers, the best,
Well, for all our listeners who have not read Reaper of Souls, I will definitely be linking it in our show notes for you to check out. Miss East, thank you so much for sharing, I'm sure, what is a difficult story to tell, as you've outlined, but I appreciate not only your work in being on this podcast, of course, but also the work that I'm sure it took to write Reaper of Souls in general, not just as a familial story, but as one that should live on rightfully as a story of Jamaican history. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to say that I wrote it. It took over 20 years to write the story. I started it, left it, mainly because I was raised in England, so I really didn't know what I was writing about in terms of the Jamaican culture. And so I left it. Then I wrote a handwriting book. And then once that handwriting book was written and doing really well, I was like, oh, I really am an author. I need to go back and write the story I was trying to write in the first place. And I just felt the only way to have written the story, I mean, I remember once I was in a writing class and a woman the teacher told me I didn't need to go to Jamaica to write the story. And I'm like, don't tell me what I need to do. You don't know my journey. So anyway, I moved to Jamaica with my son and settled in. And one of the great things about moving to Jamaica for me, which wasn't planned, was that my day job, which I'd closed my company in DC, my day job as an expert flourished from it. So I didn't come here as an expert, as a forensic examiner, but when I went on TV to ask survivors to come forward, I was on the radio asking survivors to come forward, and I had a driver that would he says, Mrs., you can't just go to these places because someone says that they're a survivor. You need someone to go with you. So he made himself that person. He says, you can't just show up because they said they are. So he would go and sit in the car, and if anything was going to go down, he was ready. Nothing ever happened. I mean, most people who said they were survivors were survivors. Some people tried to get paid for the 15 minutes they were talking to me or whatever. But I found once I'd finished the story and I'd created a voice on radio, that there was a niche for me here to have an office here. So now, 20 years later, I have an office here as a forensic examiner, which was not part of the plan, but is now very much integral as a part of my business. So I think you've heard the quote by Dr. King, you don't need to see the full staircase, you just need to take the first step. And I have that quote in my office in DC, and I feel that's what happened here. I came not really, even one of the ambassadors from Jamaica who was in DC passed away recently. Ambassador Bernal passed away. And I went to the service recently, and there were some of the staff from the Washington, DC embassy there. And one of the guys, when I told him I was moving to Jamaica to write a book, he sat me down like a big brother, and he was giving me all the reasons what I need to think about. And he says, let me help you find somewhere, because you can't just live anywhere. You need to find. So he found me an apartment opposite the Bob Marley Museum. The apartment building was Carriage House. And here was I trying to write a book about a train. I was living in Carriage House on Hope Road, opposite the Bob Marley Museum. So even when I moved into that apartment and I could see the Bob Marley Museum, I'm like, oh, everything is going to be fine. I'm going to wake up every morning and I'm going to hear Bob across the street or music from Bob across the street. Everything is going to be fine. And it was the best 2 years of my writing experience ever. And everybody was like, when are you sleeping? We hear you on the radio. We see you in the newspaper. You're taking your son to school. When are you sleeping? I'm not. I'm living on Red Bull. So I'm sure I've taken up more of your time than necessary.
No, I mean, beyond us telling the story of the railway tragedy, I think one thing I always love is listening to people's stories in general. So thank you so much, not only for sharing the story of the tragedy with us, but also sharing about how the novel came to be and your process behind that. So listeners, again, if you have not already, please check out Reaper of Souls. I will link it in our show notes for you to check out and buy, share widely. And as always, we hope you enjoyed this episode. Licklemore. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us at Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook, and at Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.